May 1945. The war in Europe was over, but its silence was heavy. Across a ruined German countryside, a slow column of women walked along a dirt road lined with shattered trees. Their gray uniforms, once symbols of a proud nation, were now torn and dulled by mud, faces hollowed by fear and hunger, eyes fixed on the ground. Behind them, American jeeps rolled quietly, their engines humming against the distant echo of a world that had stopped fighting. At a small checkpoint, a U.S. guard raised his hand, not to shout orders, not to threaten, but to pause the line. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Ladies first," he said, motioning toward a water barrel. For a moment, no one moved. The women stared, uncertain if they had heard correctly. In their world, prisoners were not treated with courtesy, especially not German ones. Yet here, in the aftermath of war, an unexpected word, ladies, carried more shock than any weapon. It was the first sign that this new world would not follow the old rules. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing under the weight of total defeat. The thunder of artillery that had once marched eastward toward Moscow now thundered westward toward Berlin. Allied bombers ruled the skies, cities lay in ruins, and millions wandered the roads as refugees, soldiers, and the displaced. Amid this chaos were women, many in uniform, who had served the Reich in hundreds of roles once reserved for men. They were radio operators, clerks, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, nurses, and field secretaries. Some had volunteered out of belief. Others had been drafted by duty or fear. In the war's final months, as the Nazi regime scrambled to defend itself, women were pulled from offices and classrooms and given rifles they had never learned to use. The propaganda of loyalty demanded it. Every German must stand for the fatherland. But when the front lines collapsed, slogans offered no protection. For these women, surrender did not mean safety. They had grown up hearing terrifying tales of what the enemy would do if Germany fell, especially the Soviets, whose vengeance was legendary. The collapse of the Eastern Front in early 1945 had already revealed brutal truths. In the East, Soviet forces advanced with merciless retribution, fueled by years of suffering under Nazi occupation. Villages burned, prisoners vanished, and women, soldiers and civilians alike, were at risk of atrocities. By contrast, the Western Front seemed almost humane. Rumors spread that the Americans and British treated captives under the rules of the Geneva Convention. Still, no one could truly believe it until they experienced it. Many German women expected humiliation, harsh labor, or worse. Yet, as they were marched into the custody of U.S. forces, something entirely unexpected awaited them. The American camps were far from paradise. They were makeshift and overcrowded, often built in open fields under a sky still heavy with the smell of gunpowder. Food was scarce, water rationed, and discipline strict. But within those barbed wire perimeters existed a code of conduct that felt foreign to defeated soldiers: restraint. The U.S. Army had been trained to see enemies as combatants, not monsters. Even as anger lingered over Nazi crimes, American command enforced an order rooted in law, not emotion. The German women entering these camps carried the psychological wreckage of a fallen ideology. Their uniforms bore the insignia of a lost cause. Their identity was shattered between guilt, exhaustion, and disbelief. When the guards addressed them with politeness, even small courtesies sounded like another language. "Ladies first" was not just a phrase, it was a cultural collision. For years, Nazi propaganda had depicted the Allies as barbaric, ruthless, and godless. Now, those barbarians were the ones offering them water, blankets, and calm words. To the Americans, these gestures were normal military discipline. To the Germans, they were disorienting. In the ashes of total war, where humanity had been buried beneath hatred, such behavior felt almost unreal. Yet it marked the beginning of something profound, a moral contrast that would echo through the post-war years. Because for every act of cruelty that defined the war, there were rare, quiet moments when civilization refused to die. This was one of them. And for many German women POWs, that moment of unexpected decency would become the most haunting memory of their captivity. Not the hunger, not the fear, but the shock of being treated as human beings again. It was the difference between victory and vengeance, and it would shape how the defeated viewed their conquerors. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, the world's armies faced an overwhelming question: what to do with millions of prisoners now crowding Europe's shattered landscape? The Allied powers each handled the task differently, and those differences revealed far more than mere logistical challenges. They exposed the values that each side carried into peace. For the Americans, the treatment of prisoners was not simply a military duty, it was a statement of identity. The U.S. Army operated under the Geneva Convention of 1929, which guaranteed humane treatment for captured soldiers, adequate food, shelter, and medical care. While conditions in the improvised camps were harsh, the intent remained rooted in discipline and law. By contrast, the Soviet Union, having suffered unimaginable losses, pursued retribution. For German prisoners in the East, captivity often meant years of forced labor, disease, and silence. That contrast was not lost on those who surrendered to the Western Allies. German soldiers, and especially women, who fell into American hands, found themselves in an environment that felt surreal. They were still captives, stripped of power, but they were no longer prey. The American guards, many of them young men far from home, followed orders that emphasized control without cruelty. They enforced discipline firmly, but with a restraint that confused their prisoners as much as it calmed them. Within those barbed wire enclosures, the daily routines of war gave way to something quieter. Roll calls at dawn, bread lines, medical checks, the occasional sound of laughter. Rare, hesitant, fragile. American medics treated wounded women without discrimination. Chaplains offered prayers, sometimes in German. There were inspections, interrogations, and endless waiting. Yet the fear that had consumed the women during capture began, slowly, to dissolve into wary curiosity. Many later recalled the first time they noticed small gestures. A soldier offering a blanket, another holding a gate open, or a calm voice addressing them as Miss. These moments did not erase the past, but they challenged everything they had been told about the enemy. To a generation raised under Nazi ideology, where weakness was despised and compassion seen as weakness, such behavior was unsettling. The phrase, "ladies first," spoken at a mess line or while distributing supplies, was more than politeness. It was the physical expression of a moral framework the Germans had been taught to believe no longer existed. It reminded them of a world where honor had not been erased by ideology. This attitude was not universal, of course. There were American soldiers who viewed all Germans with contempt, who had seen too much horror to feel sympathy. But official policy demanded control, not revenge. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, insisted on order and adherence to the rules of war. American leadership understood that how they treated their prisoners would define the moral standing of the victors. Civilization had to survive its own triumph. Meanwhile, humanitarian organizations such as the International Red Cross and various church groups began visiting camps, recording conditions, and ensuring that basic standards were met. These reports, while acknowledging the shortages caused by wartime devastation, consistently noted that the U.S. Army sought to maintain decency even amid chaos. For the German women who lived through this transition, the experience became a strange mixture of humiliation and relief. Their homeland was gone. Their uniforms meant nothing. Yet, within captivity, they found traces of dignity that had been absent during the final days of the Reich. For many, it was their first real encounter with what the Nazi regime had suppressed. the idea of mercy without motive. It was in these early months of peace that the foundations of reconciliation were quietly laid. The image of American soldiers treating prisoners with civility began circulating through word of mouth, then through post-war testimonies. It changed how some Germans remembered defeat. Instead of unending hatred, there was the faint possibility of respect, even gratitude. Because in a Europe drowned in vengeance, a few simple words, "ladies first," carried the weight of an entire civilization choosing not to lose itself in victory. For the German women held in American custody, captivity was not merely a physical experience. It was psychological rebirth through confusion. They had spent years living under a regime that glorified hardness, discipline, and obedience. Compassion had been replaced by ideology, emotion replaced by loyalty to a Führer who promised invincibility. When the Reich collapsed, that belief system crumbled overnight, leaving emptiness where certainty once lived. Inside the U.S. camps, the women were not tortured or beaten. They were given orders, yes, but also bread, water, and occasionally a smile. That unexpected humanity provoked a different kind of breakdown. Some women cried when guards spoke gently. Others turned away, ashamed to show weakness before the enemy. The sound of an American accent saying "ma'am" instead of "prisoner" stirred feelings that words could barely express. They had been prepared for degradation. Instead, they found restraint. It was not forgiveness nor friendship. It was something simpler, a reminder that decency could survive even in the ruins of war. For women who had believed the world had gone mad, that was more terrifying and more healing than any punishment could have been. The moment a U.S. guard said, "ladies first," was not just politeness, it was a cultural fracture line between two civilizations that had waged total war. In the German wartime hierarchy, women had been mobilized as tools of the state. Mothers, workers, auxiliaries. Their worth was measured by function, not individuality. Courtesy, especially from a man in uniform, was bound to rank and purpose. The Americans operated differently. Their military discipline, though strict, was anchored in a moral code shaped by democracy and religion. The belief that dignity did not vanish with defeat. "Ladies first" came not from condescension, but habit. A small reflection of a society that still clung to civilian values even in victory. To the German women, that phrase felt impossible. In their culture, defeat erased identity. To be a prisoner meant to lose gender, class, and worth. Yet here, the conqueror was addressing them as people. Not enemies, not soldiers, not propaganda, just women. The phrase struck at the core of everything Nazi ideology had taught them about strength, race, and pride. That single act, repeated across camps and lines, became a quiet instrument of cultural disarmament. It showed that power could coexist with grace, and that victory did not always demand humiliation. From a military standpoint, the humane treatment of prisoners was not only moral, it was strategic. The U.S. Army understood that maintaining order among millions of captives required more than barbed wire and rifles. It required control through discipline, not hatred. The Geneva Convention provided the framework, but field commanders knew that compassion could be practical. A well-treated prisoner was less likely to resist, riot, or attempt escape. When the guards said "ladies first," it was not necessarily sentimental, it was procedure applied with civility. But the effect went deeper than intended. Those words signaled to prisoners that they were safe within rules, that chaos had ended. It restored a sense of predictability, something priceless after years of ideological madness. The policy also carried a broader purpose. As the U.S. prepared for occupation, its officers realized that how Americans behaved toward their captives would shape post-war perception. Germany would have to be rebuilt not only from rubble, but from resentment. Every gesture of fairness became a small step toward preventing the seeds of another war. Thus, the simple civility of a phrase became part of a greater tactical victory, winning not just battles, but the peace that followed. Behind every act of restraint stood leadership. Men in command who understood that victory meant more than conquest. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces, had made it clear the war was to be won decisively, but not dishonorably. His directives insisted that prisoners of war, regardless of gender or rank, were to be treated according to international law. This discipline filtered down the chain of command. Officers and non-commissioned men were constantly reminded that cruelty undermined the very principles the Allies claimed to defend. The American military's moral authority depended on its ability to behave differently from the enemy it had defeated. To Eisenhower, this was not idealism. It was strategy wrapped in integrity. The United States had fought to destroy tyranny. It could not replace it with its own version. For the soldiers on the ground, enforcing such decency required self-control. Many had seen the horrors of concentration camps, the bodies in ditches, the burned towns. Yet the command structure demanded professionalism, not revenge. When a guard at a POW camp said, "Ladies first," he was not acting out of weakness. He was following a chain of discipline that placed civilization above rage. That was leadership in its purest form, not commanding destruction, but preserving restraint when no one else could. For the German women, captivity in American hands began as humiliation. But over time, it became an emotional paradox. They could not understand why their captors were kind. The logic of Nazi propaganda had trained them to see the world in absolutes: strength versus weakness, Aryan versus enemy, honor versus shame. Yet their captors did not fit those categories. Each day inside the camp blurred the boundaries. The guards' politeness felt unnatural, almost suspicious. When one said, "Ladies first," the phrase cut through years of indoctrination. Many later described feeling guilt rather than comfort. Guilt that they had feared such men. Guilt that their own side had caused so much suffering. And guilt that kindness could now break them so easily. Psychologists studying post-war testimonies noticed that this dissonance was profound. Kindness became a mirror reflecting the moral collapse of the regime they had served. It exposed how far Germany had drifted from humanity under Hitler's rule. For many of these women, that realization marked the start of internal reckoning, not just with defeat, but with conscience. The American camp, though fenced and guarded, offered something the Reich never had: moral clarity. In captivity, they witnessed a version of power that did not require cruelty to exist, and that, more than rations or rest, began the slow process of rehumanization. Wars often end with tribunals, treaties, and ruins, but morality survives in moments too small to record. The simple phrase, "ladies first," became one of those moments. It represented the endurance of civilization when everything else had collapsed. For the Americans, the gesture seemed trivial. For the Germans, it was shattering. It showed that their enemies still believed in the rules of decency. That revelation carried a quiet, enduring weight. When historians later reviewed Allied conduct, they found that such gestures, repeated across thousands of encounters, built the foundation for what would later become the post-war alliance between former enemies. It was not propaganda that softened hearts. It was the lived memory of humanity at its most unexpected. A sip of clean water, a respectful address, a door held open. Each act became a moral victory, not for the defeated, but for the idea that civilization itself had survived the war. In the ashes of total destruction, morality did not roar, it whispered. And those whispers, carried through memories, testimonies, and time, reminded the world that even in history's darkest chapters, decency could still illuminate the path forward. The camp stood on the edge of a broken town near Regensburg, Germany. It was May 1945. The war had ended only days earlier, but the ground still smelled of smoke and iron. Rows of barbed wire framed a muddy field where several hundred German prisoners waited, silent and motionless. Among them were dozens of women, clerks from Luftwaffe offices, Red Cross nurses, and auxiliary radio operators captured during the final collapse. The morning air was sharp, heavy with exhaustion. American soldiers moved through the camp methodically, distributing food and organizing medical checks. They were young, many no older than the prisoners they now guarded, and their expressions carried that strange mix of weariness and relief that comes only when surviving feels almost undeserved. A truck pulled up near the mess line, its engine sputtering. Buckets of thin stew were unloaded. The prisoners lined up automatically, forming an uneven column. Hunger had erased discipline. Eyes followed the ladle as if it were a weapon. The American sergeant in charge, a tall man from Ohio with a soft Midwestern accent, raised his voice above the noise. "All right, let's keep it orderly," he said, waving his hand toward the line. Then, almost casually, he added, "Ladies first." The words hung in the air. For a second, no one moved. A few of the men glanced at each other, confused. The women, gaunt, pale, and wrapped in tattered coats, stood frozen. They didn't understand at first, assuming it was sarcasm or some cruel test. But the sergeant repeated himself, calm and firm this time. "Ladies first. Step forward." A few women hesitated, then slowly moved ahead. No one stopped them. No one shouted. An American soldier even offered one a tin cup to steady her shaking hands. The others followed in silence, the moment stretching like a fragile thread between humiliation and disbelief. For years, they had been taught that the enemy was a beast, brutal, vengeful, without mercy. Yet now, as they were served food before the men, they saw something entirely different: restraint, order, respect. One woman, a former typist from Munich, would later write that it was the strangest moment of my life to be treated as a woman again, not as a soldier, not as a defeated German, but simply as a human being. The men behind them did not protest. They, too, seemed subdued by the tone of the guards. Not mocking, not superior, just firm. The American soldiers kept the line moving, speaking little. It was an ordinary act of discipline, but in that small patch of mud surrounded by ruins, it became something more. Nearby, a war correspondent from the Stars and Stripes newspaper observed the scene. He noted how the prisoners seemed almost embarrassed by the courtesy. "They looked away," he wrote, "as if they could not meet kindness with their eyes." His dispatch never made front-page news. It was buried among reports of surrenders, tribunals, and political declarations. Yet in that quiet observation lay one of the most profound symbols of the war's end: the reappearance of humanity where it had been least expected. That moment, a single line of captives moving toward a pot of soup, was small, but its meaning rippled far beyond the camp's fences. It marked the first time many of these women felt the war truly end, not with speeches or surrender documents, but with a gesture that defied hatred. The war had turned them into soldiers, stripped of gentleness and choice. In captivity, the enemy had returned what their own leaders had taken: the right to be human again. As the women ate, the American guards stood back, quietly watching. No one cheered, no one spoke loudly. The scene was unremarkable in the military record, but unforgettable to those who lived it. Later, when interviews were conducted by Red Cross officials, several German prisoners mentioned that one phrase, "ladies first." To them, it became a symbol of the unimaginable, that their conquerors had chosen decency over domination. And as that morning faded into afternoon, and the sound of clanking tin cups blended with the low hum of American trucks, a new kind of silence settled over the camp. Not the silence of fear, but of awakening. The prisoners were beginning to understand that the world beyond those fences was already changing. The next day, the same scene unfolded again, but this time it carried weight. Word had spread through the camp. The Americans had said, "Ladies first." For the prisoners, it became something whispered between tents and shared among strangers. The women lined up early that morning, still uncertain whether the kindness would return or if it had been a fleeting mistake. Yet, when the same sergeant stepped forward, clipboard in hand, he repeated the gesture exactly as before. The men once again yielded space, some even motioning for the women to move ahead. No one laughed. No one resisted. What began as confusion had evolved into quiet understanding. It was as though both sides, captor and captive, recognized that this simple phrase carried the power to bridge the unbridgeable. An interpreter working at the camp, a German-American from Chicago, later recalled the moment in his diary. "I saw shame turn to silence, and silence into something almost like respect. They didn't thank us. They didn't need to. You could see it in their eyes." Beyond the fences, the rest of Europe was unraveling. Cities burned with hunger and vengeance. In Soviet zones, the treatment of German prisoners was merciless. Hundreds of thousands were being marched eastward, never to return. But here, in this small corner of Bavaria, a handful of American soldiers were quietly demonstrating another form of victory, one not defined by domination, but by restraint. Historians later noted that scenes like these, unrecorded by official reports, remembered only in letters and testimonies, formed the hidden backbone of Allied occupation policy. The United States sought to rebuild, not to annihilate. While the world saw photographs of destruction, within the camps there were moments like this, fragments of civility shining through the rubble. To the German women, these gestures carried an emotional weight they struggled to process. They had believed that their defeat would mean degradation. Instead, they found themselves treated according to rules older than ideology, rules of decency that Nazism had tried to erase. For many, it was the first encounter with genuine equality, not the kind that came from propaganda, but from humanity itself. In later interviews conducted by post-war sociologists, several women described the moment as the beginning of forgiveness. Not forgiveness toward the Allies, but toward themselves. The Reich had demanded hardness. The Americans had shown them that gentleness could also command respect. One nurse remembered standing in line, clutching her mess tin, when the guard said those words again. "It was like hearing the past," she said decades later. "A past before the war, when men held doors, when there was still order in the world. I cried because I realized how far we had fallen." That realization spread far beyond individual emotion. American officers began noticing subtle changes in prisoner behavior. Better discipline, fewer conflicts, greater cooperation during camp duties. The humane order had created stability without fear. Ladies first had become a policy without needing to be written. In the months that followed, new waves of prisoners arrived. Women from disbanded auxiliary units, medical staff, even civilians caught in the chaos. They entered the camp expecting brutality, and instead found calm. Each new arrival carried disbelief until she saw it herself. A soldier at the gate greeting them with formal courtesy, sometimes even removing his cap. To those who had lived under the shadow of Nazi contempt, it was an education more powerful than propaganda. The transformation was not one-sided. For the Americans, many of whom had seen the darkest corners of the war, Dachau, Buchenwald, the frozen Ardennes, the act of compassion became its own form of healing. Treating prisoners humanely reaffirmed their purpose. It reminded them why they had fought in the first place. By summer's end, Red Cross reports confirmed that the American POW system had processed over 400,000 German women and men under strict regulation, with documented efforts to maintain dignity. The phrase, "ladies first," had never been written in a manual. Yet it symbolized the very thing that manuals could not teach: the moral strength of restraint. In time, those who survived captivity carried that memory home. It passed quietly through families, through whispered stories told in kitchens and diaries. For many German women, the moment marked the beginning of a lifelong rethinking of what it meant to be civilized, what it meant to be strong. That morning at Regensburg, when an American sergeant had lifted his hand and spoken two ordinary words, he could not have known that history would remember them as extraordinary. Yet they became the punctuation mark on a war that had consumed humanity. A reminder that even in victory, how one chooses to act defines what kind of peace follows. And so, in a world still trembling from violence, the phrase "ladies first" became more than courtesy. It became a quiet declaration that civilization had survived. The war had ended, but its ghosts lingered in every face, every road, every silence. For the German women who had experienced American captivity, life after release unfolded in fragments, uncertain, fragile, and burdened by memories that did not fit the narrative of defeat. The Allied occupation divided Germany into zones, and in the American sector, the transition from prisoner to civilian became an unrecorded chapter of quiet endurance. By late 1945, most female prisoners of war had been processed, registered, and released. Many returned to find their homes gone, families missing, and cities flattened beyond recognition. Yet among them circulated a strange truth: the Americans had treated them fairly. This truth spread quietly, through word of mouth, diaries, and the first letters that managed to cross destroyed postal networks. It stood in sharp contrast to what others described from Soviet territories, where captivity meant years of forced labor and suffering. The U.S. Army's records from these months reveal an extraordinary administrative effort. Hundreds of temporary camps had been established to contain millions of surrendered troops. Within that chaos, women were separated from male prisoners, given medical examinations, and placed in smaller compounds guarded under strict discipline. Food was scarce, but basic rations were issued. Diseases were monitored. Inspectors from the International Red Cross documented the conditions, often noting with surprise the order and calm within American-controlled zones. While not free from hardship, these camps operated with a sense of moral obligation. The soldiers who managed them were instructed to maintain discipline without cruelty, a concept simple in words, but profound in a Europe accustomed to vengeance. The same sergeant who had said "ladies first" in Regensburg likely never knew that his small act echoed through reports written by visiting officials. His camp, and others like it, became models of how to end a war without losing humanity. For the women, daily life remained monotonous but stable. They cleaned tents, cooked for others, and wrote short censored letters home. Some assisted U.S. medical teams as interpreters or helpers. They earned small privileges, extra bread, better blankets, through cooperation. The guards, bound by protocol, rarely crossed personal lines. Yet an unspoken understanding developed between the two sides, respect born not of equality, but of endurance. When releases began, many women left with mixed feelings. Relief was tempered by fear of what awaited outside. Germany was no longer the nation they had served. It was a wasteland divided among victors. Yet the memory of their treatment under the Americans carried forward, a lesson that strength and mercy could coexist. One former Luftwaffe auxiliary later told interviewers, "They defeated us with weapons, but they conquered us with kindness." The psychological impact of such experiences rippled quietly into post-war German identity. These women became witnesses to a paradox: that their enemy had restored the civility their own government had destroyed. They carried that realization into rebuilding, motherhood, and the slow moral reconstruction of their country. In post-war decades, when West Germany sought alignment with the United States, the roots of that trust were not only political but personal. born in camps where decency replaced hatred. Meanwhile, historians began uncovering letters, testimonies, and Red Cross notes that confirmed the significance of those months. What seemed ordinary at the time, a soldier offering water, a guard addressing captives respectfully, became evidence of a turning point in modern warfare, the moment when moral conduct itself became a weapon of peace. It was within these acts of restraint that the foundations of a new world were being laid. The old Europe of empires and revenge was gone. In its place, the seeds of cooperation were being planted, not through speeches or treaties, but through quiet gestures like those that began with two words: ladies first. As the months turned into years, the story of how American forces treated their prisoners, especially German women, faded into the background noise of Reconstruction. The headlines belonged to the Nuremberg trials, the Marshall Plan, and the birth of a divided Germany. Yet beneath that surface, countless personal accounts continued to tell a smaller, quieter truth: that mercy, even in war's aftermath, could alter the future more deeply than any political decree. The U.S. military administration recorded over 3 million German prisoners across Europe, but fewer than 10,000 were women. Their experiences, though numerically small, carried disproportionate symbolic weight. They represented the remnants of a regime that had glorified violence and obedience, now being treated with dignity by those it had called enemies. In interviews decades later, several women recalled how that moment reshaped their perception of the world. One former radio operator said, "It was not victory that humbled us, it was kindness." In many of the American-run camps, education programs were quietly introduced. Female POWs were encouraged to read, to attend discussions about democracy and human rights. What began as a logistical necessity, keeping prisoners occupied, evolved into something deeper: the reintroduction of moral and civic values long suppressed by Nazi ideology. By 1946, the first post-war surveys showed that attitudes toward the United States among released prisoners were overwhelmingly positive. For the women who had lived through both the regime's propaganda and its downfall, that transformation was profound. Beyond the camps, the American approach influenced the way occupation policy unfolded. In the U.S. zone, efforts focused not only on demilitarization, but also on reconstruction of civil society. Female prisoners who had worked in clerical or communications roles were often rehired by the new local administrations. Their familiarity with systems, typewriters, and organization made them valuable assets in rebuilding towns. Ironically, many of these women, once part of the war machine, became the backbone of post-war recovery efforts. The cultural legacy of this humane treatment spread slowly but firmly. German families who had lost sons or fathers to Soviet captivity contrasted their fates with those who had fallen into American hands. Stories of starvation and brutality from the East magnified the sense of moral clarity about the Western Allies' conduct. This perception did not erase the horrors of war, but it reframed the image of the victor. The United States emerged not only as a military power, but as a nation of principles, one whose restraint carried as much authority as its weapons. Historians today interpret these moments as part of the broader psychological transition that made Western Europe ready for cooperation rather than resistance. The Marshall Plan could succeed only because there was trust, and that trust began, in part, in the quiet civility of camps and checkpoints, in the simple humanity shown toward defeated enemies. For the women themselves, the memories remained deeply personal. Many refused to speak publicly, fearing judgment or misunderstanding. But diaries recovered years later reveal how profoundly they were moved. Some wrote of the first time they received a cigarette from an American soldier, others of being offered soap or bandages. These tokens, insignificant in scale, became symbols of a world that valued dignity over domination. As they reintegrated into a new Germany, their stories merged with the country's reconstruction narrative. The same hands that had once carried rifles or radios now typed reports, repaired offices, and raised children who would grow up in a democratic nation. Their sons and daughters would later form the backbone of a society allied with the very country that had once guarded them behind barbed wire. When historians revisit this chapter, they see not sentimentality, but strategy, a deliberate moral stance by a victorious army that understood power meant responsibility. The phrase "ladies first" was not a slogan. It was a declaration that civilization must survive even when civilization has failed. That is why, decades later, when veterans and former prisoners met again, in reunions, interviews, or silent correspondence, the memories that surfaced were rarely of battles, but of moments of grace. In a war defined by cruelty, those moments became proof that even amid collapse, humanity could still stand unbroken. History often remembers wars through battles won, cities destroyed, and leaders defeated. Yet sometimes, it is the smallest moments that leave the deepest imprint. For the German women POWs who stood in line at Regensburg, the words "ladies first" carried a meaning that went far beyond courtesy. They were a symbol, a fragile, luminous reminder that decency could survive even in the ruins of total war. In that simple phrase, the defeated found something they had been taught to believe no longer existed: recognition of their humanity. It was not charity. It was not pity. It was acknowledgement that, despite ideology, exhaustion, and surrender, they were people whose dignity mattered. That recognition became a quiet catalyst for moral reflection, shaping how these women processed their defeat and, later, how they rebuilt their lives. For the soldiers who spoke those words, the act was ordinary, almost procedural. Yet in the context of devastation, it revealed the enduring strength of leadership guided by principle rather than vengeance. Discipline without cruelty, order without malice. These were the foundations of a peace that would outlast armies and borders. The ripple of that civility extended far beyond the camp, influencing post-war policy, occupation strategy, and, ultimately, the reconciliation of nations. Decades later, historians and witnesses alike emphasize that history is not only defined by strategy or firepower, but by humanity. The encounter between American soldiers and German women POWs illustrates a profound truth: that the preservation of moral values in the aftermath of destruction can be as consequential as any battlefield victory. As the sun rose over a shattered Europe, a phrase as simple as "ladies first" became a quiet testament to resilience, civility, and hope. It reminds us that even after humanity has been tested to its limits, a small act of respect can leave an indelible mark, shaping lives, rebuilding societies, and proving that the soul of civilization can survive even the darkest chapters of history.